the Cannibals of Maine. Hello, darkness dwellers, and welcome back to the channel. Eli Nightfall here, your guide through the shadowed valleys and frostbitten peaks of fear. Tonight, we pull our chairs closer to the fire, not just for warmth, but for a fragile illusion of safety. Because outside these imaginary walls, the wind howls like a banshee and the snow falls thick and relentless, burying the world in a shroud of deceptive purity. We travel tonight to the deep woods of Maine, a place of stark beauty, yes, but also profound isolation. A land where nature reigns supreme, where civilization feels like a distant rumor, and where the silence can be as deafening as a scream. It's a place where help is often too far away, and where the elements themselves can become a prison without bars. Our story begins within such a prison, forged not of steel, but of ice and wind and endless, blinding white. Meet the Petersons, Mark, Sarah, and their 15-year-old daughter, Emily. An ordinary family seeking refuge, perhaps escape, in the tranquil solitude of a rented cabin deep in the Maine wilderness. They envisioned crackling fires, board games, hot cocoa, the quiet majesty of snow-laden pines. A postcard Christmas, far from the madding crowd. But the postcard never shows the blizzard. Not this blizzard. They called it a once-in-a-century storm on the crackling radio before the signal died. A bomb cyclone spiraling down from the Arctic, promising record snowfalls and hurricane-force winds. It arrived with the fury of a vengeful god, transforming the picturesque landscape into a churning maelstrom of white. Within hours, the roads were impassable, buried beneath drifts taller than a man. The power lines, heavy with ice, snapped like brittle twigs, plunging the cabin into a sudden, unnerving darkness. Save for the hesitant flicker of the fireplace and the few emergency candles they'd thought to pack. The phone lines went dead shortly after. No cell service reached this far into the woods, even on a clear day. Isolation, absolute and terrifying. The Petersons were trapped. Miles from the nearest plowed road, miles from the nearest town, miles from anyone, or so they thought. Mark Peterson stood at the frosted window, peering into the relentless white chaos. He was a practical man, an engineer from Boston, used to solving problems, controlling variables. But this was elemental, untamable. The wind shrieked, rattling the sturdy logs of the cabin, finding every tiny crack to whisper its icy threats. The snow wasn't just falling, it was attacking, hurled horizontally against the glass like handfuls of sand. He couldn't see more than 10 feet beyond the porch. The dense woods surrounding them were swallowed by the storm, invisible, as if the world itself had shrunk to the dimensions of their small, besieged dwelling. Anything? Sarah's voice was tight with anxiety. She sat huddled near the hearth, pulling a thick blanket tighter around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the flames as if drawing strength from their dance. Emily was curled on the sofa, pretending to read a book by candlelight, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the cover. The initial thrill of a snow day had long since evaporated, replaced by a gnawing unease that thickened the air almost as much as the wood smoke. Mark turned from the window, forcing a reassuring smile that felt brittle on his lips. Nothing but snow. Looks like we're really settled in for the long haul. He tried to keep his tone light, but the dwindling pile of firewood stacked beside the hearth betrayed his optimism. Their supplies, food, water, fuel, were meant for a long weekend, perhaps a few extra days as a buffer. Not indefinitely. Not for siege. How long can this last? Emily asked, her voice small. These things usually blow themselves out in a day or two, Mark said, walking over to toss another precious log onto the fire. Sparks flew, briefly illuminating the worried lines on his face. We just need to conserve our resources. Stay warm. We'll be fine. But even as he spoke, a different kind of chill snaked down his spine. It wasn't just the cold, or the isolation, or the dwindling supplies. It was something else. A feeling. Earlier, between the gusts of wind, he thought he'd heard something. A rhythmic crunching sound, muffled by the snow. Footsteps? Impossible. Who would be out in this? And later, standing by that same window, he'd had the distinct, prickling sensation of being watched. He'd scanned the white void, seeing nothing but the swirling flakes, yet the feeling persisted, a primal instinct screaming that they were not alone in this desolate landscape. He dismissed it as nerves, cabin fever setting in early, but the feeling lingered, a cold knot in his stomach. Sarah must have felt it too. "It just feels wrong, Mark," she whispered, glancing nervously towards the door. Barred from the inside. So quiet, yet so loud. Like the storm is hiding something. And then it happened. A sound, distinct this time, cutting through the roar of the wind. 3 heavy knocks on the cabin door. Silence fell inside the cabin, thick and sudden. The fire crackled, oblivious. Mark, Sarah, and Emily froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances. Who could possibly be out there? Knocking? In the middle of a blizzard that had swallowed the world whole? Mark motioned for Sarah and Emily to stay back, his heart pounding against his ribs. He moved towards the door, his engineer's mind racing through possibilities. A lost snowmobiler? A park ranger checking remote cabins? None seemed plausible. He hesitated. Mark slid back the bar and pulled the heavy door inward just a crack, the wind immediately tearing at it, blasting snow into the entryway. Standing on the porch, silhouetted against the swirling white, were 3 figures. Bundled heavily against the cold, their features obscured by hoods and blowing snow. They seemed almost apparitions conjured by the storm itself. The tallest figure, presumably a man, stepped slightly forward. "Neighbors," a deep voice read, barely audible over the wind, yet carrying an unnerving resonance. "Saw your chimney smoke. Thought we'd check. Make sure you folks were all right. Name's Jedediah Blackwood. This here's Martha, and our boy, Caleb. Neighbors." Mark hadn't known they had neighbors close enough to see their smoke, let alone reach them in this weather. A wave of relief warred with a persistent, inexplicable sense of dread. They looked weathered, hardy, like people carved from the very woods around them. But there was something in the stillness of the other 2 figures. Something in the way Jedediah's eyes seemed to bore into him even through the gloom, that set every nerve on edge. The blizzard raged, the fire crackled, and on the doorstep, framed by the howling white void, stood the Blackwoods, offering refuge, or perhaps something else entirely. The isolation had just been broken, but the real horror, the hunger lurking beneath the snow and the smiles, was only just beginning to stir. Stay with me, listeners. The snow holds more than just the cold tonight. It holds the Cannibals of Maine. Chapter 1. The Blinding White. The world outside the cabin had ceased to exist, devoured by a howling chaos of white. It wasn't merely snowing. The air itself had become a solid, churning mass of ice crystals and wind, hurled against the log walls with the force of thrown gravel. Inside, the Peterson family huddled near the stone hearth, the flickering firelight casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own, mimicking the storm's fury. The silence between the shrieking gusts was almost worse, a heavy, expectant stillness that pressed down on them, thick with unspoken fear. Mark Peterson stared into the flames, the log he'd just added catching slowly, reluctantly. Each piece of wood felt precious, rationed against an unknown timeline. They'd been trapped for 36 hours now, ever since the bomb cyclone had exploded over northern Maine, burying their rented solitude beneath feet of relentless snow. He was an engineer. He built bridges, designed systems, imposed order on chaos. But this blizzard, this raw, untamed power, defied calculation. It had snapped the power lines like dry twigs on the first night, plunging them into a pre-industrial darkness broken only by the fire and a dwindling supply of emergency candles. The landline, their tenuous link to civilization, had gone dead yesterday morning. His satellite phone, purchased for just such remote emergencies, displayed only one stark message: no signal. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. He ran a hand through his already messy brown hair, the gesture betraying the calm facade he fought to maintain for his wife and daughter. 48. Accustomed to being in control, Mark felt the unfamiliar tendrils of helplessness creeping in, cold as the drafts that snaked through the cabin's chinking. Sarah, his wife, sat wrapped in 2 blankets, her gaze fixed on the window, though nothing could be seen but the swirling gray-white void. Her artist's sensitivity, usually a source of quiet joy, now made her acutely attuned to the cabin's strained groans under the wind's assault, to the oppressive weight of their isolation. She'd barely spoken in hours, her silence a heavier burden than any complaint. She kept picking at a loose thread on the wool blanket, her knuckles pale. She'd initially embraced the idea of this remote Christmas getaway, a break from Boston's relentless pace, a chance to reconnect amidst nature's beauty. Now, nature felt like a malevolent entity actively trying to crush them. "I keep thinking I hear things," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper above the fire's crackle and the wind's distant moan. Between the gusts, like movement, Mark glanced at her, forcing a reassuring expression. "It's just the wind, Sarah, playing tricks," the house settling under the snow load. He didn't mention the sounds he'd heard earlier, that muffled, rhythmic crunching outside the north-facing window, too rhythmic to be falling snow or shifting drifts, or the unnerving prickle on his neck hours later, the absolute certainty that unseen eyes were watching him from the impenetrable white curtain just beyond the glass. He'd scanned the area, heart pounding, seeing nothing but the storm's fury. Cabin fever, he'd told himself. Stress. But the feeling hadn't truly dissipated. 15-year-old Emily was sprawled on the threadbare rug closest to the fire, flipping lethargically through a graphic novel she'd already read twice. Her initial excitement about missing school and being snowed in had curdled into bored resignation, now tinged with the same fear that vibrated beneath her parents' strained attempts at normalcy. She sighed dramatically, tossing the book aside. "I'm so bored. And hungry. Are we really down to just crackers and that weird canned ham?" "We have enough, Em," Mark said, his voice tighter than intended. "We just need to be careful until this blows over and they can clear the roads." He didn't add, if they could clear the roads before their food and firewood ran out. He did a mental inventory. 3 more cans of chili, 2 of beans, the aforementioned questionable ham, half a box of crackers, some peanut butter, a dwindling bag of trail mix, and maybe enough coffee for 2 more mornings. The firewood stacked inside wouldn't last more than another 2 days if the storm kept up this intensity. The thought sent a fresh wave of cold dread through him. How long can a storm like this even last? Emily asked, pulling her knees to her chest, her earlier bravado gone. The old-timer at the general store in Greenville said, "These nor'easters can sometimes sit and spin for days," Sarah said quietly, her voice laced with a remembered foreboding. "He said the woods get different during a bad storm." "Different how?" Emily pressed. Sarah just shook her head, pulling her blankets tighter. "He didn't say, just gave me this look." Mark stood up, needing to move, to do something. He walked back to the window, rubbing a clear patch on the frosted pane. The visibility was perhaps marginally better, maybe 15 feet now. Enough to see the snowdrifts climbing halfway up the cabin walls, sculpted into bizarre, wind-lashed shapes. Enough to see the impossible density of the falling snow, a relentless vertical assault. The sheer weight of it was staggering. He worried about the roof, though the cabin seemed sturdy, built of thick, interlocking logs. It was the silence that unnerved him most during the lulls. The world felt muffled, choked, holding its breath. And then he saw it, or thought he did. A flicker of movement at the edge of his cleared patch of glass. Near the tree-line, there was just a slightly darker gray shape in the blizzard's blur. Something dark, low to the ground. An animal? A deer? Maybe driven closer by the storm? He strained his eyes, wiping the condensation away again. Nothing. Just the shifting, swirling snow. Imagination. Stress. He was letting Sarah's unease infect him. He turned back to the room, clapping his hands together with forced cheerfulness. "Okay, Operation Conserve Heat. Let's make sure all the window shutters are tight. Emily, can you check the ones in the loft?" As Emily reluctantly climbed the ladder to the small sleeping loft, and Sarah double-checked the heavy wooden shutters on the main floor windows, securing the latches. Mark felt a small measure of control return. Action, however small, was better than passive fear. They sealed themselves in further, blocking out the little remaining natural light, plunging the cabin into an even deeper gloom, illuminated only by the hungry fire and 2 flickering candles. The wind seemed louder now, deprived of visual confirmation, a disembodied howl that clawed at the edges of their sanctuary. They ate a meager, early dinner in near silence. Half a can of cold chili each, a few crackers. The simple act of rationing felt grim, an admission of their precariousness. Mark tried to initiate a card game afterwards, but the enthusiasm wasn't there. The storm's oppressive presence filled the small space, leaching warmth and hope. Emily eventually retreated back to the loft. Sarah sat staring into the fire again, lost in thoughts Mark didn't dare inquire about. He was left alone with the howling wind and the gnawing anxiety in his gut. He checked the woodpile again. Definitely not enough for 2 more days at this rate. Tomorrow, storm or no storm, he'd have to try and find the outdoor woodshed, assuming it wasn't completely buried. He'd have to venture out into that. It was then, amidst a sudden, almost shocking lull in the wind's fury, that the sound came. Distinct, unmistakable, solid. Sound. 3 loud, slow knocks on the main cabin door. Knock. Pause. Knock. Pause. Knock. Every muscle in Mark's body went rigid. Sarah gasped, her head snapping up, eyes wide with disbelief and fear. From the loft, Emily whispered, "Dad? What was that?" It wasn't the wind rattling a loose shutter. It wasn't snow sliding off the roof. It was deliberate, heavy, human knuckles rapping against the thick oak door. Someone was outside, standing on their porch, in the middle of a blizzard that had rendered the world impassable. Mark exchanged a terrified look with Sarah. Who? How? Why? The questions hammered in his skull, drowning out the returning shriek of the wind. Rescue? It seemed impossible. No vehicle could have made it through. No one could have walked far in these conditions. Unless they hadn't come from far at all. The thought sent an icy sliver down his spine, colder than any draft. He held up a hand, signaling silence. He listened, straining his ears. Nothing but the storm. He moved towards the door, his stocking feet silent on the rough wooden floorboards. Every instinct screamed at him not to open it, to ignore the summons, to pretend they weren't there. It was the primal fear of the unknown. The stranger at the gates in the midst of chaos. Sound. 3 more knocks, louder this time, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. They weren't going away. Mark glanced back at Sarah, her face pale in the flickering light, her eyes pleading. But what choice did they have? If it was someone needing help, could they, in good conscience, ignore it? And if it wasn't better to know what they were facing? He took a deep breath, the air tasting like wood smoke and fear, and reached for the heavy iron bar that secured the door. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the cold metal. The heavy iron bar slid back with a grating screech that seemed obscenely loud in the charged silence. A sound that felt like crossing a point of no return. Mark's fingers, numb from more than just the cold seeping through the thick wood, fumbled for a moment with the frozen latch before turning it. He pulled the door inward, just a few inches at first, bracing himself against the immediate, violent blast of wind and snow that tore into the entryway, extinguishing one of the candles on a nearby table with a spiteful hiss and sending icy tendrils snaking across the floor. The fire in the hearth roared in protest, embers swirling like angry fireflies. Through the narrow opening, framed against the maelstrom of white, the 3 figures stood stoically on the small porch, seemingly impervious to the storm's assault. They were large shapes, bulky in heavy winter gear, their faces obscured by deep hoods and the swirling snow that clung to them like ghostly shrouds. The tallest one, the man who had spoken, took a slight, deliberate step forward, his boots crunching on a layer of fresh powder covering the porch boards. Jedediah Blackwood, the deep, raspy voice repeated, cutting through the wind with surprising clarity. "This here's Martha. He gestured with a mittened hand towards the figure beside him, slightly shorter, equally bundled. And our boy, Caleb, the third figure, standing slightly behind the others, remained unnervingly still, almost statue-like. Saw your chimney smoke. Been keeping an eye out. Storm like this. Ain't good to be alone. Figured we'd check, see if you folks needed anything. His words were plain, neighborly even, yet carried an undertone Mark couldn't quite place. Something assessing. Watchful. The eyes within the shadow of his hood seemed to glint, fixed on Mark. Mark swallowed, his throat dry. Neighbors. He hadn't even known there was another occupied cabin within walking distance, let alone one close enough for its inhabitants to see their smoke through this whiteout. The rental listing had emphasized privacy, seclusion. Mark Peterson, he managed, his voice sounding thin against the wind's howl. My wife, Sarah, my daughter, Emily. He didn't open the door further. We weren't expecting anyone. How did you even get here? Jedediah chuckled, a low, humorless sound like rocks grinding together. Know these woods, Mr. Peterson. Born and bred. Storms don't change the lay of the land, just cover it up some. Got snowshoes. Takes more than a bit of weather to keep a man housebound when there's need. He gestured vaguely back into the swirling chaos from which they'd emerged. Our place ain't far, just over the ridge yonder. He paused, letting the wind fill the silence before adding, Get mighty fierce out here. Wouldn't be neighborly to leave you folks stranded without checking in. Mind if we step inside just for a minute? Catch our breath out of this wind? The request hung in the air, heavy with implication. Letting them in felt inherently dangerous, a violation of the fragile sanctuary they'd barricaded against the storm. But turning away people who had braved these conditions, ostensibly out of concern, felt impossibly callous, almost inhuman. He could feel Sarah hovering behind him, her fear a palpable presence. He glanced back. Her eyes were wide, pleading silently for him to refuse. But the image of these figures trudging back into the blizzard, perhaps succumbing to the elements because he'd turned them away, he couldn't reconcile it. Maybe they genuinely needed shelter for a moment. Maybe they had news, information about the storm's duration, about potential rescue efforts. Hope, however faint, warred with his gut-deep sense of unease. With a reluctant sigh that misted in the frigid air pouring in, Mark pulled the door open wider. All right, just for a minute. Come in, get out of the wind. The Blackwoods shuffled inside, bringing with them a blast of frigid air and the smell of wet wool, wood smoke, and something else, something faint, metallic, and faintly unpleasant that Mark couldn't immediately identify. They stamped the snow from their heavy boots onto the small welcome mat, their movements economical, almost deliberate. As Jedediah pulled back his hood, Mark got his first clear look at the man. He was older than Mark had initially guessed, perhaps late 50s or early 60s, with a face weathered like old leather, carved with deep lines. A thick, grizzled beard, frosted with ice, covered his lower face, but his eyes were sharp, startlingly blue, and seemed to take in everything in the small cabin with a single, sweeping glance. The meager food supplies on the counter, the dwindling woodpile. Sarah and Emily huddled near the fire. Martha Blackwood remained hooded longer, her movements slower as she brushed snow from her heavy, dark coat. When she finally lowered her hood, her face was stark, severe, thin lips pressed into a firm line, gray hair pulled back tightly from a high forehead. Her eyes, dark and deep-set, didn't meet Mark's or Sarah's. Instead, they flickered around the room with an unnerving intensity, lingering for a moment too long on Emily. She offered no greeting, just a curt, almost imperceptible nod. The boy, Caleb, was last. He looked to be around Emily's age, maybe slightly older, 16 perhaps. Tall and lanky beneath his bulky clothes, he had the same dark hair as his mother, falling lankly over his forehead. But it was his eyes that held Mark's attention. They were pale, almost colorless, and seemed utterly vacant, staring straight ahead with a disturbing lack of effect as he removed his hat, revealing damp, matted hair. He didn't look at anyone or anything specific, just stared. There was a stillness about him that felt unnatural, profoundly unsettling. He stood slightly apart from his parents, radiating a quiet strangeness. The presence of the three newcomers instantly transformed the cabin's atmosphere. The small space felt suddenly crowded, claustrophobic. The fragile warmth from the fire seemed to recede, pushed back by the sheer physical presence of the Blackwoods and the icy air clinging to their clothes. Sarah had instinctively moved closer to Emily, putting a protective arm around her daughter's shoulders. Emily, usually quick with a sarcastic remark, was silent, her eyes fixed on Caleb with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. "Appreciate the shelter," Jedediah said, his voice seeming to boom in the enclosed space. He rubbed his mittened hands together. "Nasty blow. Worst I've seen in 20 years. He glanced again at the woodpile. "You folks stocked up all right? Got enough wood to ride this out?" "We have some," Mark replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Should be enough. We weren't planning on this long a stay." Jedediah nodded slowly, stroking his icy beard. Nature don't care much for plans." His gaze drifted towards the kitchen counter, where the few remaining cans of food sat. "Food holding out." "We're managing," Sarah said, her voice tight. It was the first time she'd spoken since they'd entered. Martha Blackwood finally spoke, her voice thin and reedy, yet carrying the same sharp edge as her features. "Winter demands foresight. The unprepared pantry invites hardship. Or worse." Her eyes flickered towards Emily again, a brief, chilling glance that made the hairs on Mark's arm stand up. An awkward silence descended, broken only by the crackling fire and the ceaseless moaning of the wind outside. Mark felt a desperate need to fill the quiet, to regain some semblance of normalcy. But polite small talk seemed absurd under the circumstances. These people weren't typical neighbors dropping by for coffee. There was an intensity, a raw, almost feral quality about them, masked by their practical winter gear and Jedediah's gruff pronouncements. They seemed perfectly comfortable in the silence, simply standing there, observing, their presence a heavy weight in the room. Caleb hadn't moved or spoken a word, his pale eyes still fixed on some point in the middle distance. "Well," Mark said, clearing his throat, "thanks for checking on us. Really, but we should be okay." It was a dismissal, polite but clear. He wanted them gone. The initial relief at seeing other human faces had evaporated, replaced by a rapidly growing dread. Jedediah didn't seem to take the hint. Instead, he took a step further into the room, closer to the fire, shedding melting snow onto the floorboards. "Thing is, Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice lowering slightly, becoming almost confidential. "A storm like this, it changes things. Isolates folks. Makes them vulnerable." He paused, his sharp blue eyes meeting Mark's. "It wakes things up. Old things. Hungry things." Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the lingering cold from the open door. "Hungry things?" Jedediah smiled, a brief, unsettling flash of teeth beneath the beard. "Figure of speech, maybe, or maybe not. Point is, it ain't always wise to be holed up alone, low on supplies, when the world's shut down." He gestured towards his wife and son. "We got plenty back at our place. More than enough wood. Pantry's full. Warm hearth." He paused again, the offer hanging unspoken but heavily implied in the charged air. "Might be prudent for neighbors to stick together. Share resources. Until this passes." The invitation, or perhaps the veiled warning, settled over the room like a shroud. Stick together. Share resources. It sounded reasonable, logical even, but Mark's every instinct screamed against it. There was something deeply wrong here, something hidden beneath the veneer of neighborly concern, something reflected in Martha's predatory stillness and Caleb's vacant stare. The storm outside suddenly felt like the lesser of two evils. The real danger, he suspected, wasn't the blinding white chaos raging beyond the walls. It was standing right here, inside their fragile sanctuary, smelling faintly of wood smoke, wet wool, and old blood. The isolation hadn't ended. It had just taken on a terrifying new form. They were trapped, not just by the snow, but with them. Chapter 2. Neighbors in need. Jedediah Blackwood's words, ostensibly an offer of neighborless support, stick together. Share resources, settled into the strained silence of the cabin, not as a comfort, but as a cold weight. Mark felt the implicit pressure behind the folksy phrasing. The subtle suggestion that their current situation was untenable, that accepting the Blackwoods' generosity was the only sensible, perhaps the only survivable, option. He looked at Sarah, seeking some silent confirmation of his own rising panic. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and fixed on Jedediah, her hand gripping Emily's shoulder so tightly her knuckles were white. She gave the slightest, almost imperceptible shake of her head. No. His own instinct screamed the same refusal. Every nerve ending prickled with warning. There was a predatory stillness about Martha, a disturbing vacancy in Caleb's pale eyes, and Jedediah's easy talk of hardship and hungry things felt profoundly unsafe. Inviting these people in for a moment was one thing. Putting his family entirely under their roof, under their control, in their isolated domain, it was unthinkable. That's very generous of you, Jedediah, Mark began, forcing his voice to remain steady, striving for a tone of polite finality. He consciously avoided using the man's first name again, trying to re-establish a boundary. Really, we appreciate you checking on us, but I think we'll be all right here. We're settled in. We have enough to get by for a few more days. And, well, he added, grasping for a plausible excuse, if rescue crews do manage to get through, they'll be looking for us here at this cabin. It's probably best we stay put. He tried a smile that felt tight and unnatural on his face. But thank you. Seriously. Jedediah's sharp blue eyes didn't waver from Mark's face. The folksy warmth seemed to recede slightly, like tide pulling away from a rock, revealing something colder and harder beneath. There was no immediate reply, just a moment of intense scrutiny. Mark could feel the man weighing his words, assessing his resolve. Beside him, Martha Blackwood's thin lips tightened further. A flicker of something, annoyance, disdain, crossing her severe features before settling back into stony impassivity. Caleb remained oblivious, or perhaps simply uninterested, his gaze still fixed on the empty space before him. The wind howled outside, filling the momentary conversational void, a reminder of the external prison that paradoxically made the internal threat feel even more acute. Finally, Jedediah let out a slow breath, a plume of faint mist in the cool cabin air near the door. "Suit yourselves, Mr. Peterson," he said, his tone still even, but lacking its earlier semblance of warmth. "Just looking out. Woods ain't forgiving to folks who ain't prepared. Got mostly oak and maple back at our place. Season proper. Lasts longer. Burns cleaner." He paused. "Tell you what, Caleb here can run back, fetch you an armload or two, just to help you folks stretch what you got. No trouble." It wasn't a question. It was another offer impossible to refuse without seeming overtly hostile or ungrateful. Another way to insinuate themselves, to create an obligation. Mark felt trapped. Accepting meant prolonging their presence, inviting them back, accepting a debt. Refusing felt like throwing down a gauntlet he wasn't prepared to defend. He glanced at Caleb, who hadn't reacted at all to his father's assignment. The boy just stood there, still and silent, a profoundly unsettling presence. The thought of this strange, vacant-eyed boy returning alone, bringing Wood into their sanctuary. Mark's skin crawled. "That's really not necessary," Mark started, but Jedediah cut him off with a raised hand, the gesture firm, final. "Nonsense. Neighborly duty. Caleb." Jedediah's voice sharpened, cracking like a whip. For the first time, Caleb reacted. His head snapped towards his father, his pale eyes focusing, though still lacking any discernible emotion. "Go fetch an armload of oak for Mr. Peterson. Stack it neat on the porch. Quick now." Without a word, without even a nod, Caleb turned and walked stiffly towards the door. He moved with an odd, almost mechanical gait, pulling his hood back up as he reached the threshold. He opened the door, letting in another furious blast of snow and wind, and stepped out, disappearing instantly into the white maelstrom as if swallowed whole. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving a sudden, unnerving silence in his wake. "Boy's quiet, but he's strong. And he knows the woods," Jedediah commented, turning back to Mark and Sarah. He seemed perfectly at ease, settling in as if he belonged there. He gestured towards the two worn armchairs near the fire. "Mind if we warm ourselves by your fire for a spell? Just till the boy gets back. Wind cuts right through you, even bundled up." Again, it wasn't truly a request. Before Mark could formulate a polite refusal, Jedediah was already moving towards the hearth, pulling off his heavy, snow-crusted mittens. Martha followed suit, her dark eyes scanning Sarah and Emily with unnerving intensity as she moved closer to the warmth, shedding melting snow onto the floorboards. Mark felt a surge of helpless frustration. They were making themselves at home, taking over his space, his fire. He exchanged another desperate glance with Sarah. She looked terrified, pressed back against the rough log wall, as if trying to merge with it, her arm protectively clamped around Emily. He had to regain control, somehow. "Actually," Mark said, stepping slightly in front of Jedediah, blocking his path to the chairs. "We were just about to, conserve firewood. Let the fire die down a bit for the night." It was a weak excuse, and Jedediah's knowing look told him the man saw right through it. Jedediah chuckled again, that low, grating sound. "No need for that, Mr. Peterson. Not with more wood on the way. Besides," he added, lowering his voice slightly, leaning in conspiratorially, "a low fire invites the cold. And other things." He straightened up, clapping Mark lightly on the shoulder, a gesture that felt less like camaraderie and more like a claim of ownership. "Best keep it roaring. Keeps the shadows back." He then simply sidestepped Mark and settled himself into the larger of the two armchairs, stretching his legs out towards the flames with a sigh of satisfaction. Martha chose the other chair, perching on the edge, her back ramrod straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, still watching Sarah and Emily with unwavering focus. The Petersons were left standing awkwardly in the middle of their own cabin, feeling like intruders. The air crackled with tension. Emily, sensing the shift, the palpable fear emanating from her parents and the sheer strangeness of their visitors, pressed closer to Sarah, burying her face slightly in her mother's side. Mark's mind raced. How long would Caleb take? How long would they have to endure this forced proximity, this unnerving occupation? He tried to think of something to say, some way to break the oppressive silence. But his thoughts felt scattered, clumsy. It was Martha who spoke next, her reedy voice cutting through the quiet. "Your girl," she said, her dark eyes fixed squarely on Emily. "She looks healthy. Strong stock." Sarah flinched as if struck. "She's 15, she replied curtly, her voice trembling slightly. She pulled Emily even closer. Martha nodded slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her thin lips. "A good age. Still growing. Needs proper nourishment, especially in this cold." Her gaze lingered on Emily's face, assessing, appraising, in a way that made Mark's blood run cold. It wasn't maternal interest, it felt proprietary, calculating, like a butcher eyeing a prize cut. "We have enough food," Mark interjected sharply, stepping forward slightly, placing himself between Martha and his daughter. Jedediah leaned back in the armchair, stroking his beard, seemingly amused by the exchange. "Plenty is relative, ain't it, Mr. Peterson? One man's feast is another man's famine, especially when the pantry runs dry and the woods are deep." He sighed contentedly, basking in the fire's warmth. Martha knows her provisioning. Always has. Comes from generations of knowing how to survive when times get lean. Real lean. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jedediah just smiled that unsettling smile again. "Just mean, folks around here learned long ago how to make do, how to find sustenance where others might starve. Old ways, necessary ways. Sometimes." His eyes held Mark's gaze, challenging, almost daring him to understand the unspoken implication. The faint, metallic smell Mark had noticed when they first entered seemed stronger now, mingling with the wood smoke, clinging to the heavy wool of their clothes. He thought of Jedediah's words, hungry things. He thought of Martha's unnerving appraisal of his daughter. He thought of the vast, snow-choked wilderness outside, an isolation that suddenly felt less like a shield and more like a cage shared with predators. The minutes stretched into an eternity, measured by the crackling fire, the relentless howl of the wind, and the heavy, watchful presence of the Blackwoods. Mark kept glancing at the door, praying for Caleb's swift return and their subsequent departure. Yet, a part of him dreaded the boys' return even more, dreaded the obligation the firewood represented, the implicit invitation for them to come back. They were caught in a tightening vice, squeezed between the storm and the terrifying generosity of their neighbors. Jedediah continued his quiet pronouncements about the woods, the weather, the hardships of survival, his words weaving a tapestry of veiled threats and unsettling folklore. Martha remained largely silent, her vigilant gaze never straying far from Emily. The cozy cabin had become a pressure cooker, the heat rising not from the fire, but from the sheer, unbearable tension. Mark felt his carefully constructed composure beginning to crack, the fear churning into a desperate, simmering anger. He had invited them in. He had let the danger cross his threshold. And now, he had no idea how to get it out. The wait for Caleb's return stretched into an agonizingly long passage of time. Each tick of the antique mantel clock Sarah had admired when they first arrived, now sounding like a hammer blow against Mark's frayed nerves. The silence in the cabin remained thick and heavy, punctuated only by the fire's hungry consumption of the birch logs, burning hot and fast, Jedediah had pointedly remarked, and the ceaseless, mournful symphony of the storm outside. Jedediah seemed utterly content in the borrowed armchair, occasionally adding a quiet comment about the wind's direction or the way the snow drifted against the north wall. Observations laced with the casual authority of someone intimately familiar with the landscape's deadly moods. Martha remained perched, vigilant, her dark eyes occasionally flicking towards the door, but mostly resting on Emily, who had retreated further behind Sarah, trying to make herself small. Mark paced restlessly between the window, where he could see nothing but white fury, and the hearth, feeling like a caged animal in his own home. He was acutely aware of every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind, every subtle shift in the Blackwood's postures. The metallic tang he'd smelled earlier seemed to have faded, or perhaps he'd just grown accustomed to it, replaced by the cloying scent of damp wool and the unsettling stillness radiating from his unwanted guests. Just as Mark was about to invent another, more forceful reason why they needed privacy, the heavy oak door creaked open again. Caleb stood framed in the doorway, a ghostly figure encrusted in fresh snow. His arms piled high with split logs, dark, dense-looking oak, just as Jedediah had promised. He didn't pause or wait for invitation, but stepped directly inside, letting the door slam shut behind him with a bang that made Sarah jump. He moved with that same strange, economical stiffness, crossing to the hearth without acknowledging anyone. Mark noticed a dark smudge on the sleeve of Caleb's rough canvas jacket, near the cuff, a stain that looked suspiciously like dried blood, though it could easily have been grease or mud. Caleb knelt by the existing woodpile and began meticulously stacking the oak logs, creating a neat, separate pile beside the dwindling birch. His movements were precise, almost robotic, utterly silent. He didn't grunt with the effort or even seem to breathe heavily despite the load and the exertion of moving through the deep snow. He simply stacked the wood piece by piece, his pale eyes fixed on his task, utterly detached from the tense human drama unfolding just feet away. When the last log was placed, Caleb stood up, brushed a few stray snowflakes from his sleeves, smearing the dark stain slightly, and turned, his vacant gaze sweeping past the Petersons as if they were furniture, settling finally on his father. He gave a single, curt nod. Task completed. Good boy, Jedediah said, nodding approvingly. See, Mr. Peterson, Plenty of good, slow-burning oak. Should see you through another night or two, easy. The implication was clear. You owe us. This generosity keeps you warm. Thank you, Caleb. Mark forced himself to say, though the words felt like ashes in his mouth. The boy didn't react, didn't even seem to hear him, his attention already drifting back towards that empty point in space only he could see. Mark felt the weight of the obligation settle heavily upon him. This wasn't a gift. It was a tether, a justification for future intrusions. We appreciate it, he added, trying to sound sincere. Now it's getting late. We really should be turning in, trying to get some rest. He looked pointedly at Jedediah and Martha. Thank you both again for stopping by, and for the wood. Jedediah stretched languidly in the armchair, showing no sign of moving. Rest is important, he agreed amiably, but so is vigilance. Storm like this, things get desperate. Not just critters. Sometimes folks do. He leaned forward again, his blue eyes locking onto Mark's. Reminds me of the winter of '78. Snowed for nigh on 2 weeks straight. Cut off everyone same as now. Heard stories afterwards. Families ran out of food up in the unorganized territories. Had to make hard choices. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Some folks disappeared. Never found him come spring thaw. Others seemed surprisingly well-fed. He smiled that chilling, humorless smile. Just stories, of course. Local lore. But lore often has roots in truth, don't you find? Sarah made a small, choked sound, pulling Emily even tighter against her side. The thinly veiled threat, the horrifying implication buried within the local lore, was unmistakable. Mark felt a wave of nausea mixed with cold fury. These weren't just strange neighbors. They were deliberately terrorizing his family. I think we've heard enough stories for one night, Mark said, his voice low and hard, dropping all pretense of politeness. It's time for you to leave. The directness of the command seemed to momentarily surprise Jedediah. The amiable mask slipped completely, revealing a flash of annoyance, almost anger, in his sharp eyes. Martha stiffened beside him, her thin lips pressing into an even tighter line. The air in the cabin grew colder, thicker. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound were the fire, the wind, and Mark's own heart hammering against his ribs. He stood his ground, meeting Jedediah's stare, refusing to back down. He had let them in, but he wouldn't let them stay. Not any longer. Finally, with excruciating slowness, Jedediah pushed himself up from the armchair. He stood tall, imposing, his presence seeming to fill the small room. Well now, he said, his voice dangerously soft. No need to get inhospitable, Mr. Peterson. Just making conversation. Passing the time. He glanced around the cabin again, his gaze lingering on the barred windows, the dwindling supplies. Seems you folks got everything under control then. It wasn't a question. He began pulling his heavy mittens back on, his movements deliberate. Martha rose stiffly from her chair, mimicking his actions, pulling her hood up, shadowing her severe face once more. Caleb, who had remained standing silently near the woodpile, simply turned towards the door, ready to leave, his strange impassivity a stark contrast to the boiling tension between the adults. Jedediah walked towards the door, pausing beside Mark. He was close enough now that Mark could smell the faint metallic odor again, stronger this time, mixed with the scent of cold air and something else, something vaguely earthy like damp soil. Keep that fire fed, Jedediah murmured, his voice low enough so only Mark could hear clearly. Oak burns long, gives you time to think. He clapped Mark on the shoulder again, a gesture that felt like a brand. But don't think too long. Supplies run out faster than you expect. He reached the door, Caleb already holding it open, the storm roaring its fury into the room once more. Jedediah turned back, his eyes meeting Mark's one last time across the flickering, snow-filled space. Our place is just over the ridge, he repeated, his voice carrying easily over the wind. Got a full larder, warm hearth, always room for neighbors in need. He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes, a cold, predatory gleam. You know where to find us. When you're ready. Then he stepped out onto the porch, followed immediately by Martha. Caleb paused for a fraction of a second in the doorway, his pale, vacant eyes sweeping across the room before he, too, stepped out. The door slammed shut, leaving the Petersons alone once more in the sudden, echoing silence, the only evidence of their visitors the puddle of melted snow on the floorboards, the neat pile of dark oak logs beside the hearth, and the suffocating residue of fear and dread. Mark rushed to the door, ramming the heavy iron bar back into place, the grating sound of small, inadequate comfort against the terror that lingered, cold and sharp, in the air. They were gone for now, but their parting words, the veiled threats, the unnerving focus on Emily, and that final, chilling invitation hung heavy in the room, promising that this encounter was far from over. The blizzard raged outside, but the true storm, Mark suspected, was the one gathering just over the ridge, waiting patiently for their hunger or their desperation to drive them out into the blinding white and towards the generous table of the Blackwoods. Chapter 3. The Generous Table. The moment the heavy bar slammed back into place, sealing the door against the storm and the departed Blackwoods, the fragile composure Mark had fought so hard to maintain shattered. He sagged against the rough wood, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the adrenaline that had flooded his system leaving him shaky and cold. Sarah rushed to him, her face ashen, her eyes wide with terror. "Mark? Oh God, Mark, what was that? Who are those people?" "I don't know," he whispered, pulling her close, feeling the tremors running through her body. "But they're not just neighbors." He glanced towards the neat pile of dark oak logs Caleb had left beside their dwindling birch. A Trojan horse, delivered with chilling smiles and veiled threats. Got a full larder. Warm hearth. Always room for neighbors in need. When you're ready. The words echoed in the suddenly cavernous silence of the cabin, laced with horrifying implications. Emily, who had watched the entire exchange with wide, frightened eyes, finally burst into tears. "Mom, Dad, they were scary. The way that woman kept looking at me. And the boy, he didn't even blink." Sarah immediately went to their daughter, enveloping her in a fierce hug, murmuring reassurances that sounded hollow even to her own ears. Mark pushed himself away from the door, forcing himself to think, to plan. The Blackwoods' visit hadn't just been unsettling. It had been a calculated display of power and intimidation. They knew the Petersons were trapped, isolated, low on supplies. They knew their vulnerabilities. The firewood wasn't generosity. It was a reminder of their dependence, a subtle tightening of the noose. Jedediah's talk of hard choices and folks disappearing during past storms, coupled with Martha's chilling appraisal of Emily and Caleb's unnerving presence, painted a picture too monstrous to fully comprehend, yet too terrifying to dismiss. Cannibals. The word screamed silently in Mark's mind, a relic of campfire stories and B-movies, now feeling chillingly plausible in the face of the Blackwoods' veiled hunger and primal strangeness. He pushed the thought away, or tried to. It felt too insane, too outlandish. Yet, the metallic smell, the talk of sustenance, Martha's predatory gaze. "Okay," Mark said, his voice firmer now, trying to project a control he didn't feel. "Okay, they're gone. We're safe here. For now." He moved towards the hearth, deliberately picking up one of the birch logs instead of the newly delivered oak. "We're not using their wood unless we absolutely have to. And we are not going over there. No matter what." Sarah looked up, her eyes pleading. "But Mark, the food, the firewood, what if they were telling the truth about the storm? What if it lasts for days? We won't make it." "We'll make it," Mark insisted, feeding the fire, watching the flames lick greedily at the faster-burning birch. "We'll ration harder. I'll try the satellite phone again every hour. Someone will get through eventually. We just have to hold out." He avoided looking at the oak logs, their dark presence a constant, unnerving reminder of the Blackwoods' offer and the unspoken price attached. The rest of that night passed in a haze of fear and strained vigilance. Sleep was fractured, interrupted by every creak of the cabin walls, every particularly violent gust of wind that sounded like claws scrabbling at the shutters. Mark found himself constantly checking the bar on the door, peering through tiny cracks in the shutters into the impenetrable white darkness, imagining shapes moving just beyond the range of his vision. Sarah dozed fitfully in the armchair, starting at every sound, while Emily slept curled up on the sofa, clutching a thick blanket like a shield. The oak logs sat untouched, silent sentinels radiating a cold promise. Another day dawned, or rather, failed to dawn. The world outside remained a chaotic blur of gray and white, the storm showing no sign of abating. If anything, the wind seemed to howl with renewed fury, piling snowdrifts even higher against the cabin, pressing in on them. The temperature plummeted further, the cold seeping through the logs, making the meager fire feel increasingly inadequate. Their remaining birch logs dwindled with alarming speed. Mark tried the satellite phone repeatedly. Nothing. The silence on the other end was as absolute as their isolation. Their rations shrank visibly. Breakfast was half a cracker and a smear of peanut butter each. Lunch was the last can of beans, shared 3 ways, eaten cold to conserve the precious coffee they were saving. Hunger gnawed at them, a constant, cramping presence that frayed tempers and amplified fear. The cozy cabin now felt like a cage, the walls closing in. The silence between them grew heavier, filled with unspoken anxieties. Even Emily's usual teenage energy had dissolved into lethargic despair. By late afternoon of that second day, after the Blackwoods visit, the birch logs were gone. Only the dark, dense oak remained. Mark stared at it, his jaw tight. Using it felt like a surrender, an acceptance of the Blackwoods' insidious generosity, a step closer to their terrifying orbit. But the alternative was freezing. The fire was already dying down, the cabin rapidly losing its battle against the encroaching cold. Sarah shivered uncontrollably beneath her blankets. Emily huddled close to the hearth, her lips tinged with blue. He had no choice. With a muttered curse, Mark picked up one of the heavy oak logs and placed it on the embers. It caught slowly, reluctantly, but soon began to burn with a steady, enduring heat, filling the cabin with a different kind of warmth, one that felt tainted, compromised. As the first oak log burned, driving back the worst of the chill, a fragile sense of relief warred with Mark's profound unease. They had bought themselves more time, but the cost felt immense. They were now literally burning the fuel provided by the people he suspected of wanting to do them unimaginable harm. It was just as dusk began to bleed into the unrelenting gray twilight outside that it happened again. Not a knock this time, but a voice calling out, surprisingly close. "Peterson! Oh, Peterson!" Jedediah Blackwood's voice, muffled by the wind and the thick cabin walls, but unmistakable. Mark froze, his blood turning to ice. Sarah gasped, her eyes flying to the door. "They're back," she whispered, pure terror in her voice. Mark moved cautiously to the nearest shuttered window, cracking it open just enough to peer out. Through the swirling snow, he could make out a single figure standing about 20 yards from the cabin, near the edge of the now invisible tree line. Jedediah. He wasn't approaching the porch, just standing there, a dark shape against the white, cupping his hands around his mouth. "See, you're burning the oak," Jedediah shouted, his voice carrying on the wind. "Good. Keeping warm. Listen now. Martha's got a stew on. Big pot, plenty to share. Dear Caleb brought down for the storm hit. No sense you folks going hungry over there when we got plenty. Come on over. Follow my tracks back. Warm fire, hot food. Be neighborly." The invitation hung in the frigid air, amplified by the howling wind. Dear Caleb brought down. Mark's mind flashed to the dark stain on Caleb's sleeve. Was it deer blood? Or something else? The thought was sickening. But the offer, hot stew, a warm house, after nearly 2 days of near starvation and encroaching cold. It was a temptation almost physical in its intensity. He could feel his stomach clench with hunger. He saw Sarah looking at him, her face etched with a desperate conflict, fear warring with the primal need for warmth and sustenance. Emily, too weak and cold to even cry now, just shivered, her eyes pleading. Going to the Blackwoods cabin felt like walking into a trap. Every instinct screamed danger. Jedediah's talk of hard choices, Martha's predatory stare, Caleb's vacant strangeness. It all pointed to something deeply wrong, something monstrous lurking beneath the surface of their rustic facade. Yet, staying here meant slow starvation. Freezing when the wood inevitably ran out again. Rescue seemed increasingly unlikely. The storm was relentless. They were trapped, weakened, vulnerable. Jedediah knew it. This invitation wasn't just generosity. It was exploiting their desperation. "Mark, what do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We can't stay here like this. Emily's getting sick from the cold. We have no food left." He looked at his daughter, pale and shivering, her usual vibrant energy completely extinguished. He looked at his wife, her face gaunt with hunger and fear. He looked at the dying embers in the hearth, knowing the oak wouldn't last forever. Staying meant certain, slow demise. Going meant facing an unknown, but potentially immediate horror. But it also meant a chance, however slim, for warmth, for food, for survival. It was a devil's bargain, offered by people who might very well be devils themselves. "All right," Mark said, the word tasting like defeat, like poison. "All right, we'll go." He ignored Sarah's gasp, the fresh wave of fear in her eyes. "But we stick together. We watch everything. We eat only what we see them eat. And the first sign of anything wrong, anything at all, we run. Understand?" Sarah nodded numbly, pulling Emily closer. "Okay, Mark. Okay. Bundle up," Mark commanded, trying to inject some authority into his voice, trying to mask the terror churning in his own gut. "Everything warm you have. Double layers." As they piled on their inadequate winter clothes, Mark felt a chilling certainty that they were making a terrible mistake. He slipped the small, heavy-duty flashlight he always kept in his emergency kit into one deep pocket and his multi-tool into the other. Pitiful defenses against whatever awaited them, but better than nothing. He glanced one last time around the small cabin that had briefly felt like a sanctuary and now felt only like a cage they were desperate to escape, even if it meant running towards a potentially far greater danger. Steeling himself, Mark unbarred the door and pulled it open. The wind ripped at them, biting cold, stealing their breath. Jedediah stood patiently, a dark silhouette against the swirling white, waiting. He raised a hand in acknowledgement, then turned and began trudging back the way he came, leaving a clear path of deep footprints in the snow. "Stay close behind me," Mark ordered Sarah and Emily, pulling his own hat down tight. "Hold hand if you need to." He took a deep breath of the icy, cutting air and stepped out onto the porch, pulling the cabin door shut behind them, leaving their fragile refuge for the uncertain promise of the Blackwoods' generous table. The journey had begun. They were following the tracks into the heart of the storm, towards a warmth that might consume them, toward a hunger that might devour them whole. The wind struck them like a physical blow the moment they stepped off the small porch, stealing the air from their lungs and driving icy particles into their eyes and mouths. Mark immediately regretted the decision, a visceral, gut-deep certainty that they were walking willingly into oblivion. But turning back was no longer an option. Their cabin, barely visible now, just a few yards behind them through the swirling snow, offered only the slow certainty of freezing or starvation. Ahead, Jedediah Blackwood trudged steadily onward, a dark, broad-shouldered shape already merging with the gray chaos. Reaching back to grab Sarah's mitten hand, she gripped it tightly, her other arm wrapped around Emily, who stumbled forward, head bowed against the onslaught, already shivering violently despite her layers. The snow was deeper than Mark had realized, easily knee-high in places, drifting higher against unseen obstacles. Each step was a monumental effort, biting at exposed skin with needle-sharp teeth. Visibility dropped to mere feet, the world reduced to a maelstrom of swirling white flakes, the howling wind a constant, disorienting assault on their senses. They were navigating blind, utterly dependent on the receding figure of Jedediah and the trail he forged. Jedediah moved with an unnatural ease, his long strides steady and sure, never pausing, never looking back to see if they were keeping up. He seemed less to fight the storm and more to be a part of it, an elemental force navigating his domain. He carried no light, yet moved with unerring confidence through the near-zero visibility, as if he could sense the contours of the land beneath the drifts, the hidden rocks and fallen logs. Mark struggled to match his pace, pulling Sarah and Emily along, his lungs burning from the exertion and the frigid air. Emily whimpered occasionally, her small sounds swallowed by the wind, stumbling frequently, her slight frame no match for the blizzard's power. Sarah gritted her teeth, her face grim, focusing solely on placing one foot in front of the other, her grip on Mark's hand a desperate anchor. Time lost all meaning in the white chaos. It could have been 10 minutes or an hour. The monotonous struggle, the biting cold, the roaring wind, the suffocating lack of vision, it created a disorienting sensory deprivation chamber. Mark's mind, numb with cold and fear, kept replaying Jedediah's words. Hard choices, folks disappeared, surprisingly well-fed, hungry things. The rhythmic crunch of his own boots in the snow beneath the wind's howl began to sound horribly like chewing. He shook his head, trying to clear the morbid thoughts, focusing only on following the dark shape ahead, on keeping his family moving. Doubt gnawed at him. Had Jedediah even mentioned deer? Or had he just said Caleb brought it down? The ambiguity felt sinister now, deliberate, just as Mark felt his own strength beginning to fail, the wind driving ice crystals under his eyelids. Blurring his vision further, Jedediah stopped. He waited for them to draw level, his face impassive within his snow-caked hood. They had reached the crest of a small ridge Mark hadn't even realized they were climbing. Below them, nestled in a dip, barely visible through the swirling snow, was a structure. The Blackwood cabin. It wasn't what Mark had expected. Larger than their rented cabin, it was built of darker, rougher-hewn logs, stained almost black by weather and time. It seemed to crouch low against the snow-laden ground, less a cozy dwelling and more a primitive fortress hunkering down against the elements. No warmth. Inviting light spilled from the windows. They were dark, shuttered squares, like vacant eyes staring out into the storm. Smoke curled from a thick stone chimney, momentarily visible before being ripped away by the wind, the only sign of life within. Strange, geometric symbols, vaguely unsettling in their asymmetry, were carved crudely into the main beam above the low doorway. The overall impression wasn't welcoming. It was forbidding, ancient, secretive. An unnatural stillness seemed to emanate from it, even amidst the blizzard's roar. The faint, metallic, earthy smell Mark had noticed before seemed stronger here, carried on the wind, mingling with the wood smoke. "Home," Jedediah grunted, gesturing towards the dark structure. He started down the slope, his boots finding purchase on the snow-covered incline with practiced ease. Mark hesitated, a powerful wave of reluctance washing over him. This place felt wrong. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to face the slow death in their own cabin rather than whatever awaited them here. But Emily stumbled beside him, leaning heavily against Sarah, her shivering intensifying. They couldn't go back. They had made their choice. With a heavy heart, Mark urged Sarah and Emily forward, down the slope towards the Blackwood cabin, towards the dark wood and the unsettling carvings, towards the promise of warmth and the threat of the unknown. The porch was low, covered in deep drifts except for a narrow path cleared to the door. Jedediah didn't knock. He simply lifted a heavy iron latch and pushed the thick plank door inward, revealing not warmth and light, but a deep, shadowed interior. He stepped inside without a word, expecting them to follow. Mark took another deep breath, tasting snow and dread, and ushered Sarah and Emily over the threshold, out of the raging storm and into the oppressive stillness of the Blackwood home. The door swung shut behind them with a heavy, final thud, the sound echoing in the sudden, muffled quiet. The contrast with the outside was immediate and jarring. The roar of the wind was instantly muted, replaced by a heavy silence broken only by the loud crackling of a massive fire burning in a cavernous stone fireplace that dominated one entire wall. The air inside was thick, warm, almost uncomfortably so, and heavy with the mingled sense of wood smoke, damp wool, something vaguely spicy and savory simmering nearby, and that persistent underlying metallic tang. Stronger here, undeniable. It wasn't the cozy warmth of their own cabin. It felt close, suffocating, ancient. The main room was larger than their rental, dominated by the huge hearth and a long, rough-hewn table made of thick slabs of dark wood, set with mismatched earthenware plates and crude wooden bowls. The walls were dark, unadorned log, interspersed with shelves cluttered with strange objects Mark couldn't immediately identify. Bundles of dried herbs, oddly shaped tools, pieces of bone artfully arranged, and several animal skulls mounted directly onto the logs. Or at least, Mark hoped they were animal skulls. Some seemed unsettlingly proportioned. The flickering firelight cast deep shadows, making the corners of the room feel vast and unexplored, hinting at other doorways leading off into further darkness. There were few comforts, no soft chairs like the ones Jedediah and Martha had commandeered in their cabin, just hard wooden benches alongside the table and a couple of stiff-backed rocking chairs near the hearth. The overall feeling was one of stark, primitive utility, combined with an unsettling layer of ritualistic clutter. Martha Blackwood stood near the massive fireplace, turning slowly as they entered. She wasn't cooking, as Jedediah had implied. She was simply standing there, watching the flames, her severe face illuminated by the orange glow. She wore a simple, dark wool dress, her gray hair still pulled back tightly. She offered no greeting, no smile, just watched them shed their outer layers of snow-caked gear with those same dark, unnervingly intense eyes. Her gaze lingered on Emily again, that same calculating appraisal that made Mark's skin crawl. Caleb was there too, sitting on one of the hard benches near the wall, whittling a piece of wood with a long, sharp-looking knife. He didn't look up as they entered, his concentration absolute, shavings falling silently onto the floor around his boots. He seemed even paler and stranger in the firelight, his movements precise and economical, the knife seeming like an extension of his hand. The object he was carving was indistinct in the flickering light, but it looked disturbingly like a small, crude human figure. "Get yourselves warm by the fire," Jedediah instructed, already shrugging off his own heavy coat and hanging it on a peg near the door. "Martha'll have the stew ready soon. Smells good, don't it?" The aroma was rich, thick, meaty, emanating from a large black cauldron hanging over the fire. It should have been inviting, stimulating their gnawing hunger. But overlaid with the cabin's oppressive atmosphere, the strange artifacts, Martha's silent scrutiny, and Caleb's disturbing hobby, it just felt ominous. Mark felt his stomach churn, hunger warring violently with revulsion and fear. He forced himself to lead Sarah and Emily towards the hearth, positioning himself protectively between them and the room's other occupants. The heat from the massive fireplace was intense, almost scorching, but it did little to dispel the chill that had settled deep in his bones. "Thank you for having us," Sarah murmured, her voice barely audible, avoiding Martha's gaze. Martha finally acknowledged her, turning her head slowly. "Hospitality is a sacred duty," she said, her voice thin and reedy, devoid of warmth. "Especially when the pantry is full and others are lacking." Her eyes flickered towards Mark's family again. "Waste is a sin the old spirits don't forgive." Jedediah chuckled, pulling one of the rocking chairs closer to the fire. "Martha takes her duties serious. Always has." He settled into the chair, stretching his boots towards the flames. "Make yourselves comfortable. Food's almost ready. Best hot meal you'll have had in days, I reckon." Comfortable was the last thing Mark felt. He felt trapped, exposed, scrutinized. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every strange object on the shelves felt like a piece of a horrifying puzzle he didn't want to solve. He watched Martha move towards the cauldron, picking up a large, dark wooden ladle. He watched Caleb continue his silent whittling, the knife blade flashing in the firelight. He felt the weight of their stares, the suffocating warmth, the heavy silence beneath the crackling fire. They had escaped the storm, yes, but they had walked directly into the heart of something far older, far darker, and infinitely more dangerous. The generous table was set. The stew simmered, and the Petersons waited, caught in the web, wondering desperately what exactly was on the menu tonight. The air in the Blackwood cabin grew thicker, heavier, pressing in on Mark and his family as they stood awkwardly near the immense hearth. The heat radiating from the fire was almost unbearable. Yet it did nothing to warm the icy dread coiling in Mark's stomach. He kept his body positioned slightly in front of Sarah and Emily, a flimsy human shield against the palpable strangeness of their hosts and the unsettling ambience of the room. Jedediah rocked slowly in his chair, the rhythmic creak of the wood grating on Mark's nerves, his sharp eyes tracking their every movement. Martha ladled the stew from the black cauldron into the crude earthenware bowls already set on the long table. The stew itself was thick, dark red, almost unnaturally so, filled with large chunks of unidentifiable meat and root vegetables. The aroma, initially just rich and meaty, now seemed cloying, overly sweet beneath the savory notes. With that persistent metallic tang cutting through all, it didn't smell like any deer stew Mark had ever encountered. "Come on now, sit yourselves down," Jedediah urged, gesturing towards the long wooden bench opposite where Caleb sat silently whittling, seemingly oblivious. "Food's hot. Best eat it while it is." Reluctantly, Mark guided Sarah and Emily to the bench. The wood was rough, worn smooth in places by generations of use, cold despite the roaring fire. Sitting down felt like a further surrender, placing them at the mercy of their host's unsettling hospitality. Caleb didn't acknowledge them, his knife continuing its steady, rhythmic scraping against the wood in his hands. The small figure he was carving looked more defined now in the closer proximity, unmistakably human, small, and crudely jointed. A shiver traced its way down Mark's spine. Martha placed the heavy bowls before them with deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness. Steam rose from the dark concoction, carrying that strange, sweet metallic scent directly into their faces. She then placed bowls before Jedediah and herself, and finally one before Caleb, who paused his whittling just long enough to accept it before setting it beside him on the bench, his attention returning immediately to his carving. He showed no sign of hunger, no interest in the meal his mother had prepared. Martha and Jedediah, however, picked up their rough wooden spoons immediately. "Dig in, folks," Jedediah mumbled around his first mouthful, chewing with gusto. "Good and hearty, just what you need after being out in that blow." He ate noisily, seemingly oblivious to the tension radiating from the Petersons' side of the table. Martha ate with a similar lack of ceremony, her movements efficient, her gaze still unervingly intense as she watched them. Mark looked down at the bowl before him. The chunks of meat were large, fibrous, disturbingly pale beneath the dark, thick gravy. He picked up his spoon, the wood feeling rough and alien in his hand. His stomach cramped violently, torn between desperate hunger and profound revulsion. Beside him, Sarah stared at her bowl as if it contained poison, her face pale green in the firelight. Emily just looked numb, her eyes glazed over, shivering despite the oppressive heat. "Eat," Mark whispered urgently, nudging Sarah gently. "We have to eat something. We need the strength." He knew, instinctively, that showing weakness, refusing their generosity outright, would be dangerous. They had to play along, at least for now. He forced himself to scoop up a spoonful of the stew, the aroma making him gag slightly. He raised it to his lips, the heat scalding, the texture disconcertingly soft, almost mushy. He swallowed quickly, trying not to taste it, trying not to think about Jedediah's local lore or the source of Caleb's deer. It settled like a lead weight in his stomach. He took another spoonful, forcing it down, fighting the rising nausea. Sarah, seeing Mark eat, hesitantly took a tiny spoonful herself. Her eyes widened slightly, and she quickly put the spoon down, pressing a hand to her mouth. Emily refused to even pick up her spoon, just shaking her head mutely, tears welling in her eyes. "Girl, ain't eatin'," Martha observed, her voice sharp. "Stu, not to her Lee Keen. She's just cold and tired," Mark intervened quickly. The walkover was hard on her. "Cold makes you hungry," Martha stated flatly, her eyes narrowing. "Needs meat to build strength. Fight the chill." She took another deliberate spoonful from her own bowl, her gaze fixed on Emily. Jedediah paused his eating, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Maybe she needs encouragement," he suggested, a predatory glint in his eye. "Like we used to encourage Caleb when he was being picky. Sometimes you gotta persuade folks to take what's good for him." Mark felt a surge of protective fury. "She'll eat when she's ready," he said firmly, meeting Jedediah's gaze. "Leave her be." An uneasy silence fell again, broken only by the sound of Jedediah and Martha eating and the incessant crackling of the fire. Mark forced himself to take a few more bites, scanning the contents of his bowl with peripheral vision, dreading what he might find. Root vegetables, potatoes, carrots, parsnips perhaps, stained dark by the gravy. And the meat, always the meat. Soft, stringy pale. Not like any venison he'd ever had. More like pork? No, softer still. Veal? Chicken? None of those felt right. It was Emily who saw it first. Her breath hitched in a sharp, terrified gasp. Mark and Sarah turned to her instantly. She wasn't looking at her bowl, but at the floor near Caleb's feet, among the wood shavings from his whittling. Her eyes were wide with horror, her face utterly drained of color. Mark followed her gaze. Partially obscured by the shadows and the debris lay a small object Caleb must have knocked aside or discarded. It wasn't a wood shaving. It was small, white, and unnervingly familiar. A fingernail, perfectly formed, small, like that of a young woman or child, ripped crudely from its bed. Mark's stomach lurched violently. He felt the bile rise in his throat. A fingernail. Here, stringy meat swimming in the dark gravy. It wasn't deer. It wasn't pork. It was human. They were eating human flesh. He shoved his bowl away with a strangled cry, the earthenware scraping loudly against the rough wood. Sarah, seeing his reaction, seeing the object on the floor, finally understood. A low moan escaped her lips, and she clamped both hands over her mouth, her body shaking uncontrollably. The charade was over. The horrifying truth laid bare between them. The reaction from the Blackwoods was instantaneous. Jedediah slammed his spoon down, the amiable facade vanishing completely, replaced by a cold, hard fury. Martha rose slowly from the bench, her eyes blazing with a terrifying intensity. Even Caleb stopped whittling, his head lifting, the pale eyes focusing on them with a sudden, chilling alertness, the long knife held loosely, expertly, in his hand. The air crackled, the oppressive warmth suddenly feeling like the heat of a furnace preparing to consume them. "Seems our guests ain't appreciate fine cookin'," Jedediah snarled, pushing his chair back, standing up to his full, imposing height. His shadow, thrown by the firelight, stretched monstrously across the log wall behind him. "Waste," Martha hissed, her voice trembling with a fanatic's rage. "Sinful waste. After we shared our bounty. Get Emily," Mark choked out, shoving himself backward from the bench, scrambling to his feet. Sarah run, but there was nowhere to run. Jedediah moved with surprising speed for his size, blocking the path to the door. Martha circled around the other end of the table, her movements slow, deliberate, cutting off any escape towards the shadowed corners of the room. Caleb rose silently from his bench, the whittling knife held low, its blade gleaming in the firelight. His vacant expression replaced by something terrifyingly focused, predatory. Mark grabbed the heavy wooden bench he'd been sitting on, adrenaline surging through him, overriding the nausea and terror. "Get away from us," he screamed, hefting the bench, preparing to swing it. Jedediah laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. "Bit late for that, Mr. Peterson. You came to our table, accepted our hospitality." He took a step forward, cracking his knuckles. "Now you get to be part of the larder, like the others before you." Sarah screamed, grabbing Emily, trying to pull her toward the back of the room, away from the immediate threat. But Martha intercepted them, grabbing Sarah's arm with surprising strength, her fingers like iron bands. Sarah cried out in pain and fear, tried to twist away. Mark roared and swung the heavy bench towards Jedediah, aiming for his legs. But Jedediah sidestepped the clumsy attack with practiced ease, letting the bench crash harmlessly against the log wall. Before Mark could recover, Jedediah lunged forward, grabbing the front of Mark's jacket, slamming him back against the wall with bone-jarring force. Mark's head connected with the rough logs, stars exploding behind his eyes. He gasped for breath, pinned, Jedediah's grizzled face inches from his own, the man's breath hot and foul, smelling of the horrific stew. "Should have stayed put in your own cabin," Jedediah growled, his grip tightening, cutting off Mark's air. "Should have known better than to refuse neighbors in need, especially neighbors with particular tastes." His eyes glinted with cruel amusement and a hunger that was no longer veiled. Across the room, Sarah struggled desperately against Martha's grip, kicking and shouting, while Emily sobbed hysterically, paralyzed by terror. Caleb advanced slowly towards them, the knife held ready, his pale eyes fixed on Sarah, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips for the first time. The fire roared in the hearth, casting monstrous, dancing shadows. The stew cooled in the bowls on the table, a testament to the broken taboo, the ultimate horror revealed. The trap had been sprung, the hunt had begun, and the Petersons, weakened, terrified, and sickened, were the prey. Chapter 4. Ancient Hungers. Mark gagged, the stench of Jedediah's breath, foul meat and decay, flooding his senses as the man's powerful grip tightened like a vice around his throat, pinning him against the rough-hewn logs. Stars exploded behind his eyes again, not just from the impact, but from the rapidly diminishing oxygen. Panic clawed at him, raw and primal. Jedediah's face, inches away, was a mask of triumphant cruelty. The folksy neighbor vanished entirely, replaced by the predator revealed. "Like the others before you." The words echoed in Mark's oxygen-starved brain, confirming the unspeakable. They weren't the first. This isolated cabin, this seemingly hospitable family, was a well-practiced trap. He scrabbled uselessly at Jedediah's thick forearms, his fingers finding no purchase, his strength pitiful against the older man's brutal power. He could hear Sarah screaming his name, a sound thick with terror and pain, punctuated by Emily's hysterical sobs. He twisted his head desperately, catching a glimpse of the unfolding horror across the room. Sarah fought like a cornered animal against Martha's iron grip. Martha, though wiry and older, possessed a surprising, frenetic strength fueled by righteous fury. She held Sarah's arm twisted behind her back, forcing her to her knees. Her other hand tangled brutally in Sarah's hair, yanking her head back. Martha's face was contorted, her thin lips peeled back from her teeth in a snarl. "Ungrateful defiler," she spat, her voice cracking with fanaticism. "You refuse the sacrament. You scorn the sustenance." Sarah kicked out, trying to find purchase on the floorboards, trying to wrench free, but Martha held fast, her knuckles white, and advancing slowly, deliberately, towards them was Caleb. The vacant look in his pale eyes was gone, replaced by a chillingly focused intensity. He moved with that same unnerving, silent grace, the long, whittling knife held low, its blade gleaming wickedly in the firelight. His gaze was fixed not on Sarah, but on Emily, who cowered behind her mother, paralyzed by terror, tears streaming down her face. Caleb was stalking his chosen prey. A fresh surge of adrenaline, born of pure paternal terror, flooded Mark's system. No, not Emily. He couldn't fight Jedediah's strength directly, but maybe distraction. His right hand, scrabbling against the wall, brushed the pocket containing the heavy metal flashlight. His fingers fumbled, closing around the cold cylinder. With a final, desperate surge of effort, ignoring the crushing pressure on his windpipe, Mark wrenched the flashlight free and swung it upwards with all his might, connecting solidly with the side of Jedediah's head, just above the temple. Sound, a solid thunk, followed by a grunt of pain. Jedediah roared, not just in pain, but in surprise, his grip momentarily faltering. He stumbled back half a step, shaking his head, one hand flying to the point of impact. It wasn't enough to incapacitate him, not nearly, but it was the opening Mark needed. He gasped, sucking in a ragged, precious breath, and shoved himself away from the wall, stumbling sideways. He didn't run for the door. Jedediah was still too close, recovering too quickly. Instead, reacting purely on instinct, he lunged towards the cluttered shelves lining the wall beside the hearth. The ones laden with dried herbs, strange tools, and those unsettling skulls. He swept his arm across the nearest shelf, sending its bizarre contents crashing to the floor in a cascade of brittle bone, dried leaves, and strange rattling objects. Skulls, definitely not all animal, one disturbingly small and childlike, bounced and rolled across the floorboards. Bundles of herbs burst apart, releasing a pungent, acrid dust into the air that made Mark cough and his eyes water. Strange, rune-etched stones clattered loudly. The chaos was immediate, startling. For a precious second, the Blackwoods' attention was diverted. Jedediah paused his advance, momentarily distracted by the clatter and the rolling skull near his feet. Martha glanced towards the noise, her grip on Sarah loosening almost imperceptibly. Even Caleb hesitated in his slow advance, his pale eyes flickering towards the rolling objects. "Sarah, now!" Mark screamed, coughing through the herbal dust. Sarah seized the moment. With a surge of desperate strength, she twisted violently, breaking Martha's loosened grip on her arm. She shoved backwards, scrambling away from the older woman, pulling Emily with her. Martha shrieked in rage, lunging after them, but Sarah, fueled by terror, was faster, dragging Emily towards the shadowed back corner of the room, away from the main table and the fireplace. Mark scrambled backwards himself, putting the overturned mess between him and Jedediah, his eyes scanning desperately for a weapon, an escape route. The main door was still blocked. The windows were heavily shuttered, likely barred from the outside. Were there other doors? He glimpsed a low, heavy-looking plank door set into the back wall, partially obscured by shadows and hanging animal pelts. An exit? Or something worse? Jedediah recovered quickly, his face livid, a trickle of blood running from his temple where the flashlight had connected. "Clever," he snarled, kicking aside a rolling skull with contempt. "Just delays the inevitable." He started forward again, deliberately crunching over the debris on the floor, his eyes fixed on Mark with murderous intent. Mark hefted the flashlight again, its weight feeling pitifully inadequate. He backed away further, bumping against the long dining table, his hand landing near the discarded bowls of stew. The smell, the sight of the congealing contents, sent another wave of nausea through him, but also sparked a desperate idea. He grabbed the nearest bowl, his own, and flung its horrific contents directly at Jedediah's face. The thick, gruesome stew splattered across Jedediah's beard and chest. He roared again, this time in pure disgust and fury, momentarily blinded, swiping frantically at his face, chunks of the pale meat clinging obscenely to his beard. It bought Mark another crucial second. He vaulted over the bench, putting the long table between himself and his attacker. But the Blackwoods adapted quickly, their movements coordinated, practiced. While Jedediah was momentarily occupied, Martha abandoned her pursuit of Sarah and Emily, changing direction, moving swiftly around the opposite end of the table to cut off Mark's path towards that back door. Her face was a mask of cold fury, her earlier fanaticism replaced by chillingly practical menace. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the set of tools beside the enormous hearth, its end still glowing faintly red from the embers. She held it like a weapon, advancing on Mark from the other side. He was trapped between them. Jedediah, wiping the last of the stew from his eyes, his face contorted with rage. Martha, advancing steadily with the glowing poker. And across the room, Caleb had resumed his slow, relentless advance on Sarah and Emily, who were pressed into the darkest corner, Sarah trying desperately to shield her daughter, searching frantically for anything to use as a weapon in the shadows. Caleb raised the knife, its point glinting. He was only feet away from them now. "Leave them alone," Mark screamed, feinting towards Martha, then dodging back as she swung the hot poker in a vicious arc that hissed through the air where he'd been moments before. The heat washed over his face. He could feel the situation spiraling rapidly out of control, their brief moments of resistance only serving to enrage their captors further. These people weren't just killers. They were hunters, skilled and experienced, toying with their prey. He risked a glance towards Sarah and Emily. Caleb was almost upon them. Sarah frantically pushed Emily behind her, grabbing a small, three-legged stool from the corner, holding it up defensively. It looked laughably inadequate against the gleaming knife in Caleb's hand. Caleb paused, tilting his head slightly, considering the obstacle with detached curiosity, before taking another step forward, the faint, chilling smile returning to his lips. The knife rose higher. Mark knew he had only seconds before the unthinkable happened. He had to do something, anything, to draw Caleb's attention, to break the deadly tableau unfolding in the corner. With no other option, Mark braced himself, took a deep breath, and charged directly at Martha, aiming to tackle her, to create one last, desperate diversion, praying it would be enough. Mark's desperate charge towards Martha was pure instinct, a primal scream against the inevitable. He lowered his shoulder, aiming for her midsection, hoping to knock her off balance, to break the deadly pincer closing around him and draw Caleb's lethal attention away from Sarah and Emily. Martha, however, reacted with the speed of a cornered viper. Instead of trying to dodge or block the tackle, she pivoted slightly and brought the heavy iron poker, still glowing faintly red at the tip, down in a vicious two-handed chop, not aiming for his charging body, but for his leading leg. Sound, a sickening sizzle and a sharp crack, followed by an agonized scream. Excruciating, searing pain exploded in Mark's left thigh. He screamed, his charge collapsing instantly as his leg gave way beneath him. He crashed heavily onto the rough floorboards, the impact jarring through his entire body. Blinding agony pulsed from his thigh where the poker had connected, burning through his jeans, searing flesh, likely breaking bone. The smell of burnt fabric and his own cooked flesh filled his nostrils, adding another layer of horror to the nausea already churning within him. He writhed on the floor, clutching his thigh, the pain absolute, overwhelming, stealing his breath, blurring his vision with hot tears. Through the haze of agony, he saw Martha standing over him, the poker held ready, her face impassive, almost bored, as if dispatching vermin. The brief diversion had failed utterly. Worse, it had crippled him, rendering him helpless. Jedediah, seeing Mark incapacitated, let out a low, satisfied grunt and turned his full attention back towards the corner where Caleb was closing in on Sarah and Emily. The boy hadn't even flinched at Mark's scream or fall. His focus remained absolute. Predatory. "Caleb," Jedediah commanded, his voice calm now, chillingly matter-of-fact. "Bring the girl. Leave the woman for your mother." Caleb nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and lunged forward. Sarah screamed Emily's name, shoving the flimsy stool towards Caleb's face. He batted it aside, contemptuously with one arm, the knife in his other hand darting forward like a snake's tongue, aiming not to kill, but to disable. Sarah cried out again, stumbling back as the blade sliced through the thick fabric of her coat sleeve and scored a deep, bleeding gash along her forearm. She clutched her injured arm, blood welling quickly, staining the dark wool, her eyes wide with pain and terror. But she didn't fall. She scrambled backwards, pulling Emily further into the shadowed corner, desperately searching the floor, the walls, for anything, any escape. Martha, meanwhile, advanced on the wounded Sarah, the poker held low now, a tool for hurting rather than striking. "Nowhere left to run, dearie," she crooned, her voice sickly sweet, a terrifying counterpoint to the violence. "Best come quiet now. Make it easier on yourself." And the girl. Mark watched helplessly from the floor, the agonizing throbbing in his leg, a sickening counterpoint to the terror gripping his heart. He tried to push himself up, but the slightest movement sent white-hot lances of pain shooting through his thigh, threatening to make him black out. He was useless. He had failed. His family was about to be overwhelmed, dragged into the Blackwoods' monstrous larder, and he could do nothing but watch. But Sarah wasn't finished. Her eyes, frantic and desperate, scanned the dark corner where they were trapped. Her gaze fell upon a pile of thick animal pelts heaped against the wall, bearskins, deer hides, rough and heavy. Behind them, barely visible, was the low, heavy plank door Mark had noticed earlier. An escape? A root cellar? A pantry? It didn't matter. It was the only potential way out. Behind the pelts. "Now!" Sarah screamed, shoving Emily towards the heavy pile. As Martha advanced, poker ready, Sarah did the unexpected. Instead of trying to fight or flee further, she turned and hurled herself bodily at the heaped furs, using her weight to try and dislodge them. To reveal the door behind, the heavy skins shifted, some tumbling to the floor with muffled thuds, revealing the dark wood of the door, secured by a simple wooden crossbar latch. Martha hesitated for a split second, surprised by Sarah's desperate maneuver. Caleb, however, reacted instantly, seeing his intended prey scrambling towards a potential escape route. He abandoned his slow stalking and lunged, covering the remaining distance in 2 quick strides. He reached for Emily, his free hand snatching at her jacket. Emily screamed, twisting away. Scrambling frantically over the fallen pelts towards the door Sarah was desperately fumbling with. Sarah wrenched at the heavy wooden bar, her injured arm screaming in protest, blood smearing on the rough wood. The bar was stiff, resisting her efforts. Caleb's fingers closed on the back of Emily's coat. He yanked her backwards. Emily shrieked, flailing, kicking back with her boots, connecting with Caleb's shin. He grunted, his grip faltering for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Emily to wrench free and scramble the last few inches towards the door. Sound, the heavy wooden bar sliding back with a loud scrape. Sarah, with a final, desperate heave, slid the bar free. She yanked the low door open inward, revealing not steps leading down, but darkness, pitch black, cold air rushing out, carrying a smell far worse than the stew. A charnel house stench of decay, old blood, and something indescribably foul. "In! Go!" Sarah screamed, shoving Emily through the opening into the absolute blackness beyond. Caleb lunged again, trying to grab Emily before she disappeared, but Sarah threw herself in his path, intercepting him, absorbing the impact of his charge. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs just inside the dark doorway, Sarah fighting furiously, scratching, biting, fueled by pure maternal ferocity, trying to buy Emily precious seconds. Caleb snarled, frustrated, bringing the knife up again. Martha, seeing the escape attempt, shrieked in rage and charged towards the open doorway, the poker raised high. Jedediah bellowed, pushing himself away from Mark, forgotten momentarily in the chaos, and lumbering towards the back of the room. Mark, lying helpless on the floor, watched the chaotic struggle unfold in the doorway, the flickering firelight casting grotesque shadows. He saw Emily disappear into the blackness. He saw Sarah fighting like a demon to keep Caleb and Martha back. He knew Sarah couldn't hold them off for long. He had to do something. Ignoring the blinding agony, he dragged himself across the floor, leaving a smear of blood behind him, towards the hearth. His hand reached for the discarded poker Martha had dropped when she charged the doorway. It was still warm, heavy. He gripped it, the rough iron biting into his palm. He couldn't stand, couldn't fight directly, but maybe he could change the equation. His eyes fell on a massive stone hearth, on the roaring fire itself, logs blazing fiercely, embers glowing like the eyes of hell. An insane, desperate idea formed in his pain-addled mind. With a guttural roar, fueled by agony and desperation, Mark used the poker as a lever. Pushing against the floor, ignoring the screaming protest from his shattered leg, he lunged towards the hearth, not to attack, but to act. He jammed the poker deep into the heart of the fire, scattering blazing logs and showering sparks onto the dry wooden floorboards around the stone hearth. Then, gritting his teeth against the pain, he began frantically shoving the burning logs out of the fireplace and onto the floor, pushing them towards the center of the room, towards the spilled debris, the dried herbs, the wooden table and benches. Flames licked instantly at the dry floorboards, catching on the scattered herbs and wood shavings, spreading with terrifying speed. Smoke began to billow, thick and acrid, filling the already suffocating air. Fire! Mark screamed, hoping Sarah could hear him, hoping this final, suicidal act of defiance would give her and Emily the chance they needed. The cabin's on fire. The sudden eruption of flames, the rapidly thickening smoke, threw the Blackwoods into momentary disarray. Jedediah stopped his advance towards the back door, turning, his eyes wide with disbelief and fury as he saw flames beginning to chew at the floor and lick up the legs of the ancient table. Martha hesitated near the doorway, torn between capturing her prey and dealing with the immediate threat to her home. Even Caleb paused in his struggle with Sarah, looking back towards the growing inferno. In that moment of hesitation, Sarah reacted. With a final, desperate surge of strength, she kicked Caleb hard in the chest, sending him stumbling backwards out of the doorway, choking on the sudden influx of smoke. She didn't wait to see if he fell. She scrambled backwards into the pitch-black opening where Emily had disappeared and slammed the heavy plank door shut, plunging that corner of the room into near darkness, broken only by the terrifying orange glow of the rapidly spreading fire. Mark heard the heavy wooden bar scrape back into place from the other side, just as Jedediah reached the doorway and began hammering on it with his fists, bellowing in rage. Mark collapsed back onto the floor, coughing violently as the smoke thickened, the heat intensifying. Flames were climbing the walls now, devouring the pelts, reaching for the low ceiling beams. The Blackwood cabin was becoming an inferno. He had trapped himself in the fire with his monstrous hosts, but he had bought Sarah and Emily a chance. Lying there, amidst the smoke and flames, the agonizing pain in his leg almost a distant sensation now, Mark closed his eyes, a single, grim thought echoing in his fading consciousness. Run, Sarah. Run, Emily. Survive. Chapter 5. Blood in the Snow. The heat intensified with terrifying speed, flames roaring as they consumed the dry logs of the ancient cabin, the accumulated clutter of generations providing ample fuel. Thick, black smoke billowed, stinging Mark's eyes and scorching his lungs, making each breath a painful, choking gasp. He lay on the floor near the hearth, the searing pain in his leg a constant, agonizing throb, watching helplessly as the inferno he'd unleashed devoured the Blackwood's den. Jedediah had abandoned hammering on the heavy plank door behind which Sarah and Emily had disappeared. The immediate threat of the fire was too great. He bellowed orders, his voice hoarse with rage and smoke, trying futilely to beat back the flames near the main entrance with a heavy bearskin rug, succeeding only in feeding the fire more oxygen. Martha, coughing violently, stumbled back from the growing blaze near the center of the room, her face streaked with soot, her eyes wide with a mixture of fury and panic. The sacred home, the repository of generations of their dark traditions, was being consumed. Caleb, seemingly less affected by the smoke, or perhaps simply indifferent to the flames, stood near the back wall, his pale eyes fixed on the heavy door his prey had vanished behind. the knife still held ready, as if waiting for them to be flushed out by the heat. The fire crackled and roared, timbers groaned overhead, and the air grew thick with the stench of burning wood, melting tallow from unseen candles, and something else, the sickeningly sweet smell of cooking meat as the leftover stew in the bowls began to char and bubble in the intense heat. Mark knew he didn't have long. The smoke was becoming unbearable, the heat blistering. He had to get out, or this pyre he'd created for the Blackwoods would become his own tomb. But escape seemed impossible. The main door was blocked by Jedediah and the advancing flames. The back door was barred from the other side, leading into unknown horrors. His leg was shattered. Useless. He dragged himself painfully backwards, away from the worst of the heat near the hearth, towards the relative cool near the sidewall where he'd crashed after Martha had struck him. His vision swam, consciousness flickering like the flames engulfing the room. Then, through the roaring inferno and Jedediah's enraged shouts, he heard it, a splintering crash from the back of the cabin, near where Sarah and Emily had disappeared. Not from the door they'd escaped through, but from the exterior wall itself. Had Sarah found another way out? Hope, faint but fierce, surged through him. He craned his neck, peering through the swirling smoke. Jedediah heard it too. He stopped beating at the flames and whirled around, his face a mask of disbelief. What in damnation? From the shadowed back corner, near where the low door led, came the unmistakable sound of wood splintering, giving way. A section of the thick log wall, likely weakened by rot or previous damage hidden behind the pelt Sarah had torn down, was being broken outward. A blast of frigid air and swirling snow cut through the smoke as several logs gave way, revealing the raging blizzard outside. And framed in the jagged opening, axe in hand, stood Sarah. Her face was grim, determined, streaked with soot and blood from the gash on her arm, but her eyes burned with fierce resolve. She must have found the heavy woodshed axe stored in whatever lightless hell lay beyond that plank door, and used the last of her strength to hack her way through the weakened wall, creating an escape route. Emily wasn't visible. Presumably, Sarah had pushed her out first. "Sarah," Mark croaked, his voice barely audible above the roar of the fire. She saw him, her eyes widening in shock, then hardening with determination. But before she could react, Caleb moved. With terrifying speed, he abandoned his vigil at the inner door and lunged towards the new opening, towards Sarah. He was faster, uninjured. He would reach her before she could possibly climb out. "No!" Mark screamed. He looked around desperately. Jedediah was momentarily frozen, staring at the breach in his wall. Martha was staggering, overcome by smoke, near the center of the room. Mark's gaze fell upon the heavy rocking chair Jedediah had occupied earlier, now dangerously close to the spreading flames. With a final, agonizing surge of adrenaline, ignoring the screaming agony in his leg, Mark shoved himself towards the chair. He gripped its sturdy wooden arm and pushed with all his remaining might, toppling it directly into Caleb's path just as the boy lunged towards Sarah. Caleb tripped, snarling in frustration, crashing heavily onto the floorboards, the knife flying from his grasp and skittering into the shadows. It bought Sarah the second she needed. She scrambled through the jagged opening in the wall, disappearing into the blinding snowstorm outside. Jedediah roared in fury, finally reacting. He ignored Mark, ignored the flames now licking at the ceiling beams, and charged towards the breach in the wall, intent on pursuing his escaped prey. Martha, coughing and wheezing, stumbled after him. Caleb pushed himself up, retrieving his knife, his pale eyes locking onto Mark, lying helpless on the floor nearby. A cold, reptilian smile spread across his face. His prey might have escaped for the moment, but here was another, wounded and waiting. He started towards Mark, knife raised. Mark closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable. He had done all he could. Sarah and Emily were out. They had a chance. That was all that mattered. He heard Caleb's soft footsteps approaching, heard the crackle of the flames, felt the blistering heat intensify. Sound, a sudden loud crack and groan from overhead. followed by a tremendous crash. Mark's eyes snapped open. A huge section of the blazing roof, weakened by the fire, had collapsed inwards, showering the center of the room with burning timbers, sparks, and choking debris. The crash sent shockwaves through the cabin. Caleb stumbled back, momentarily shielded from the worst of the debris by the heavy table, but forced to retreat from the sudden intensification of the fire near Mark. Jedediah and Martha, who had almost reached the breach in the wall, were caught directly beneath a shower of smaller burning fragments. Martha screamed as a flaming beam struck her shoulder, setting her clothes alight. Jedediah bellowed, swatting at embers, burning his hair and coat, momentarily forgetting the escapees and his own struggle for survival. Through the chaos, Mark saw his chance. The breach Sarah had created wasn't far. Painfully, agonizingly, he began to drag himself towards it, using the poker in his good arm, ignoring the searing agony in his leg, pulling his useless limb behind him. Smoke filled his lungs. Burning, choking. Flames licked closer. Debris rained down around him. But the thought of Sarah and Emily, out there alone in the blizzard, possibly pursued, drove him onward. He reached the jagged opening, the freezing air and swirling snow, a shocking, painful relief against his scorched skin. He could see Sarah, only a few yards away, helping a sobbing Emily to her feet in the deep snow. Sarah looked back, her eyes finding marks in the fiery opening. Her face registered shock, then desperate hope. "Mark," she screamed, starting back towards him. "No, go, run," he choked out, waving her away frantically. "Get Emily out. I'll slow them down." Behind him, Jedediah had beaten out the flames on his clothes and was lumbering towards the opening again, his face a mask of inhuman rage. Martha lay moaning on the floor, flames beginning to consume her. Caleb, navigating the fiery debris, was also heading for the breach, his eyes fixed on the escaping figures outside. Mark knew he couldn't make it out, not with his leg, not with them right behind him. But he could buy his family more time. He looked at the collapsing structure around him, the burning walls, the groaning timbers overhead. With the last of his strength, he used the poker to push against a key supporting beam near the breach, one already charred and weakened by the fire. He shoved with all his might, ignoring the pain, the heat, the choking smoke. The beam groaned, splintered, and gave way. Sound, a final, catastrophic series of cracks and a deafening roar as the rest of the roof and the surrounding walls collapsed inward. The entire back section of the cabin imploded, collapsing in on itself in a fiery avalanche of burning logs, stone, and debris. The breach Sarah had created vanished under tons of flaming wreckage. Mark felt a final, searing heat wash over him, heard Jedediah's final, enraged bellow cut off abruptly, and then blackness. Oblivion. Sarah dragged Emily through the blinding snow, away from the collapsing, burning cabin, the roar of the final collapse echoing behind them like the closing fist of hell. She didn't look back, couldn't look back. Mark's last desperate act, his sacrifice, burned in her mind. A fresh agony laid atop the terror and the freezing cold. Tears froze on her cheeks as she half-carried, half-dragged her sobbing daughter through the disorienting white chaos. Where were they going? Back to their own cabin? It seemed miles away, an impossible journey in their current state, through knee-deep snow, injured, exhausted, hunted. But it was the only landmark they knew, the only potential, however fragile, sanctuary. The blizzard raged around them, indifferent to their plight, its wind howling like the tormented spirits Jedediah had spoken of. Every shadow seemed to hold the shape of Caleb. Every gust of wind sounded like Jedediah's bellow. Was it over? Had the fire claimed them all? Or were they still out here, somewhere in the white hell? Hunting? Sarah didn't know. She couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to think. She just put one foot in front of the other, pulling Emily along. Fueled by the last dregs of adrenaline and Mark's final, desperate command, survive. Blood from the gash on her arm dripped onto the pristine snow, leaving small, dark stains in their wake. tiny breadcrumbs in the vast, hungry wilderness. She prayed the falling snow would cover their tracks quickly. She prayed they were truly alone now. But deep in her heart, a cold dread lingered. The ancient hunger of the Maine woods felt vast, patient, and perhaps not entirely contained within the ashes of the Blackwood cabin. The snow fell harder, burying the evidence, burying the dead. But the silence that followed the fire felt heavy, watchful, and deeply, deeply wrong. And so, the fire consumes, and the snow falls, attempting to bleach the horror clean. But some stains, some hungers, run too deep to be erased by flames or buried by blizzards. Did Sarah and Emily find their way back? Did they escape the woods? Or did something else, awakened by the scent of blood on the snow, find them first? Sometimes, survival is just the beginning of another nightmare. Thank you for joining me in the shadows tonight. If this descent into the icy heart of hunger chilled you to the bone, be sure to conjure a like from the spectral plane, leave your fearful thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more journeys into the terrifying unknown. Ring that notification bell like a funeral toll so you don't miss the next tale from the crypt. Until next time, dwellers in darkness, stay vigilant. The world is full of neighbors, and not all of them have your best interests at heart. Sleep tight if you can.